Hello and welcome to the 7th of this summer's Digital Classes London seminar, which for the moment will be the last of the summer series. We do have another one coming up at some point in autumn. We'll keep you posted, so be on the lookout on the usual places where you get notifications about this seminar. First, I want to say thank you for everyone currently in the chat, especially to Charlotte Tupman, who's joining us today to present her research. Thanks to everyone watching live on YouTube, and in advance to everyone who would watch this on their own time later on. A reminder to everyone watching online, you can leave questions in the comment section, which we can see and Charlotte will address at the end of the talk. So today we welcome Charlotte Tupman from Exeter, who is going to talk to us about Reconsidering the Roman workshop, applying machine learning to the study of inscribing texts. Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Simona, and thank you to everybody for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to go over to my slides, if I may. Thank you. I should say to start with that I'm a member of the Digital Humanities Lab at the University of Exeter, and I have one foot in the DH Lab and the other foot in the Department of Classics and Ancient History. So I'm based across both of those areas. And I'm going to be talking to you today about one of my particular interests, which is in drafting and stone cutting processes in Latin inscriptions. For those of you who are less familiar with inscriptions, they're one of our main sources of evidence for the ancient world. We've got many hundreds of thousands of inscriptions in Greek and Latin alone. And they tell us about all sorts of different aspects of ancient life. And the job of the epigrapher or epigraphist, depending on your preference, is to analyze the inscriptions, to contextualize them, and to help us to write ancient history through their evidence. In terms of what we have left, this is what we'd like to find. In an ideal world, we would have an inscription that's very easy to read. Everything's still there, there's no damage. In reality, what we tend to find is lots and lots of fragments. And we have to try to piece together from those fragments what would have been there. And so here's an example where there are various fragments to the stone, and you can see there's been some reconstruction of what would have been missing. For those of you who do work on inscriptions, you might enjoy this particular quote, which I came across the other day. This was written in 1960 as a review of the amazing work of Arthur and Joyce Gordon. And it was pointing out that at that point, very few scholars had spent a lot of time devoting themselves to the stones themselves rather than the text that they contained. Now, thankfully now that's not the case. We have a lot of examples of work that's been done on the stones themselves. I've got a few examples here. Susini, published in both Italian and in English, produced a seminal work on the Roman stonecutter, looking at lots of aspects of creating inscriptions, and we'll talk a bit about that later. Joyce and Arthur Gordon, in their contributions to the paleography of Latin inscriptions, and also their album of dated Latin inscriptions in several volumes, produced something that's actually probably still unsurpassed, I would say, in terms of intricate analysis of Latin inscriptions and how they were created. Evetts, this book here, is a study primarily of an inscription on Trajan's column, and he looks very, very closely at letter forms. And then Richard Grasby on the right-hand side looked at processes of creating Roman inscriptions from the perspective of somebody who himself was a letter cutter. So he had a lot of expert knowledge of letter cutting by hand, and he applied that to analysing Roman inscriptions. And we'll meet some of these as we go along. So what have these scholars managed to discover about how inscriptions were created? Well, there seem to have been three main stages in the process. The first is that the text was drafted. So somebody would come to a workshop, for instance, and they would discuss the text that they wanted, and the wording would be decided at this stage. Then in the second stage, the wording would be transferred onto the stone with some kind of outline that guides the hand of the letter cutter, essentially. Now, that could be done in several ways. People have argued that sometimes it would have been done using a paintbrush, so brush strokes. It could have been done with charcoal. You can also see that there were lines drawn on the stone sometimes, guidelines. There are a couple of examples here. You can see that there are both vertical and horizontal guidelines on this stone for each of the lines, and vertical lines at the left and the right hand side. So that was intended to point out where the inscription should be carved. And then the third stage is obviously the actual cutting of the letters themselves, and that's the part that we understand best of all, I'd say. Here's a nice impression that I found of what a Roman stone cutting workshop might have looked like. Somebody cutting a stone there, just to help us to visualize this. It's possible that some of these tasks were done by the same person. It's also possible that they were divided up, depending on the workshop. So a different person might have created the text in terms of the wording, and then the next person might have drawn the guidelines and set the letters out on the stone. And then you might have had a third person, a sculptor, to do the cutting itself. It's pretty much obligatory to show you this inscription. This is a shop sign from Palermo, and it's advertising the services of a workshop. And you can see here that it's saying tituli haec ordinantur et sculpuntur. So it's saying inscriptions are arranged and cut here. And this is one of the very few inscriptions that we have along these lines that actually give us a bit of a window into how those workshops might have advertised themselves. We do have some depictions of stonecutters working on their texts. This is one from the column of Trajan, and we can get some idea by looking at both depictions like this in relief and also archaeological evidence, which we'll look at in a second, of the kind of tools that stonecutters would have used when they were working. And this stonecutter, I've just noticed that this stonecutter looks like he's in terrible peril because the chap on the top left is holding what looks like a very heavy block of stone right over his head. Anyway, we can see that we do have some evidence for stoneworking tools from archaeology. To the left and on the right-hand side, we've got some Roman examples. You can see that there are various hammers, chisels, and we have quite a lot of evidence. There have been projects that have studied this, and projects like the Art of Making have studied stoneworking tools and the processes by which inscriptions and sculptures were created. So we've got a bit of evidence from the archaeological field there. And the interesting thing about that is that, in fact, letter cutting has changed very little. In the meantime, in terms of letter cutting by hand, they're basically using the same kind of tools that were used in the Roman period. A hammer and chisel, are various different types of materials, but you can see that the general shapes of the tools are not dissimilar. It's worth saying at this stage that we're used to seeing inscriptions in museums. Sometimes they're painted in, but in fact, those tend to be the result of reconstruction at various times in the stone's history, curators in the past tended to perhaps find a little bit of paint in the inscription and think it would be a good idea to paint the rest of the inscription in red paint. And so there are lots of examples of that. But a lot of stones would have been painted, including the sculpture. And here's an example of the tombstone of Caecilius Avitus. And this is from Chester. And you can see here that somebody's done a reconstruction. I'm sorry, I forget who was responsible for this, but I can look it up. Basically, we need to remember that older stones would have been painted. The inscription wouldn't necessarily have just stood alone. Now, also just a little bit of background. It's worth saying that things didn't always work out perhaps as intended. There are a couple of examples here. Here's an inscription where you can see maybe for the first 5 lines or so, it seems to have been relatively well planned. We can see that the letters are fairly straight. For the final 4 lines, however, you can see that the letters very much slope down towards the right-hand side. I think that's pretty clear to see here. Here's another example. This is an altar, and again, the letters look as if they've been planned out, but there was a border on the stone, and you can see right at the foot here that the stonecutter appears simply to have continued over the end of the border. So it exists, but it appears to have been ignored. And inscriptions like this really give us an interesting window on the process, not only of the lettercutter themselves, but also the people who perhaps were coming before them in that process and actually planning out where the text would go. It's worth, I think, thinking about the fact that what we think of as a stonecutter's error is not always a stonecutter's error, and this has been pointed out by various people at different times. Misunderstandings can clearly occur in several parts of the process, and we shouldn't always be too quick to blame the stonecutter themselves, because there was this planning process that lay behind the creation of these texts. However, there is very clear evidence that some inscriptions were incredibly carefully designed, and here I'm going to turn to the work of Richard Crasby, who was, sadly he died a few years ago. He was a lettercutter who worked all his life as a stone cutter, and he produced one of the main works, in fact, on lettercutting in the modern age. And he had a deep interest in the processes behind creating Latin inscriptions in the Roman period. And he wrote a number of very, very detailed studies on specific stones. He published in the papers of the British School at Rome, and then he published a series of studies which I think can still be obtained from the Centre for Study of Ancient Documents in Oxford. And he found that there were what he called modules underlying the creation of these inscriptions, and you can see here, I hope, some of these. Now, if you can, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but no, I don't think you can. Or perhaps you can. You can see on the left here that he's basically created a grid over the top of the inscription. So this is a grid which essentially controls the layout of the text, and you can see it's divided up into these modules, and some of the lines correspond directly to that measurement, and some of the lines have some additional spacing. I don't think it's going to be a good idea to go into a huge amount of detail about specific inscriptions here, but I'm happy to return to this if you'd like to do so. What I really want to point out here is that on the right-hand side, top right, I hope you can see that he found that letters themselves on this inscription and others that he studied sort of came with their own spacing, as it were. In other words, a letter would have its own space plus some extra spacing that was allocated to it. And to illustrate what I mean, perhaps we could look at the letter B. You can see that it's 11 units wide, then it has another 9 units of space that's allocated to it. And then if we look at, say, letter D, it's 18 units wide, and then it has 2 more units of space allocated to it. And what Richard found was that in a line of inscribed text, the letters and the spacing were all present according to that scheme, but the spacing was arranged outside of the outside of that scheme, in that the spacing was allocated to the letter but didn't necessarily correspond directly to where the letter was, but the spacing existed throughout the line. I hope that makes sense. It's quite hard to explain without further reference to Richard's work, but the total amount of space, if you add all the letters together, existed in the line but was spaced out differently depending on the text. We can come back to that if you like. Richard was actually very generous in helping people to understand how inscriptions were cut, and gave a lot of time to the practical epigraphy workshops, which some of you might have attended. If we take a look at this inscription, this is from Caerleon, and the inscription here, which is RAB 330, was originally placed above the gate into the fortress, and this is an inscription in honour of Trajan. It was set up in almost certainly 99, and then in 100, the eagle-eyed amongst you might be able to spot that the third one after cos in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th line, the third one doesn't quite match the others, and that seems to have been because it was set up in 99, but the one was added in 100 when Trajan became consul for the third time. And what Richard did was he worked backwards from the stone to analyse this spacing of the letters on the inscription. And he produced a copy of the stone, having analysed this the modules that underlay the spacing of the inscription. And what he found from the work he did on this stone and many others was that the texts were planned out very intricately, further back than people had perhaps previously thought. He found clear evidence that there were modules that we used at the planning stage, so when the text was transferred onto the stone for the lettercutter. And he found, interestingly, that the proportions were consistent across a number of stones that he studied. So if we return very briefly to this, I don't know whether you can see it on the bottom right-hand side. You can see that there's a ratio between the stem height and the stem width of the letter. So that letter width and stem height, you can see that in this case, we've got 1 to 10. So if you look at the P, for instance, you can see that it's 1 unit wide, 10 units high. He found in various inscriptions that the ratios were 1 to 8, 1 to 10, 1 to 12, depending. And the fact that they were consistent across a number of stones led him to believe that there were sort of standardized modules that were used to create some kinds of inscriptions. And obviously this isn't the case everywhere. There are plenty of examples of inscriptions that don't seem to show any planning at all, but he was very interested in trying to work out, where it was possible to do so, what those modules were. And bearing in mind that he was looking at a small number of stones very, very intricately, I thought it would be interesting to consider what we could potentially do now, thinking about the images that are now available to us. If we think about the databases that exist, and specifically the images that they make available, I'd say that the most useful one for this particular purpose is probably EDH, the Epigraphic Database at Heidelberg, because it makes all of its data available to download and reuse. And that's actually been a key factor for us in being able to do this project at all. I'd like to thank Frank Grayshaber very much actually for the assistance that he gave the project. We decided to take a subset of the 39,000 images that have been made available by EDH in order to undertake a large-scale study of how inscriptions are planned out in the Roman world. We wanted to do that because we thought that if we understood a bit more about how inscriptions were planned out, it could help us when we came across fragmentary texts. We might be able to produce more accurate reconstructions if we understood a little bit more about the planning processes, and particularly about that line spacing issue. We wanted to look at aspects of Roman craftsmanship that haven't been particularly well studied. It's worth saying that epigraphers tend to measure line heights. That's a standard thing to record, but we don't spend a great deal of time thinking about line widths and spacing. So there seemed to be a fair amount of work to be done there. And extremely tentatively, it would be interesting to think about whether such work could potentially point us in the direction of the work of specific workshops, but that's to come in the future, I think. So our question is, can we use machine learning to identify and measure on a large scale how inscriptions were laid out? And at this point, I really had absolutely no idea what the answer to that question might be. And I went to talk to a colleague at my own institution called Jack Christmas, who works in computer science. And I said to her, is there any possibility that you would be interested in doing a project together and trying to think about how to approach this problem? And it turned out that she was actually quite interested from a computer science point of view, just as I was interested from an ancient history point of view, because she was interested in the possibility of being able to identify where text existed in what I would describe as problematic images. So images where, the contrast was very low, or there's damage to the stone, damage to the surface, that kind of thing. So we got together and we managed to get some funding from the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at Exeter to employ for a period of 6 months at half time a computer science research fellow called Dmitry Kangin, and we decided to work with him to try and figure this problem out. And when we discussed how we might do this, because I have to say I didn't know anything about machine learning at this point whatsoever, and was relying on them to understand the machine learning side of things, and they were relying on me to understand the research problem, and the two sort of between us, we sort of learnt from each other and worked out that it would be a good idea to try training a natural scene text detector to handle images of inscriptions. Now, you can see here that we've been using one called EAST, which stands for Efficient and Accurate Scene Text Detector. And this has been trained on images from the modern world, obviously. And the idea that it looks for word and line level text in an image. And here are some examples. We've got some on a bus, we've got some on signposts and shop signs and so on. So it's looking for characters that exist in an image. And we're using a supervised learning model, so that's concerned with object detection. We're using neural networks, so that's algorithms that look for patterns, essentially. And you train it as a kind of iterative process. So you provide it with images, and then it gives an output, and you point out the areas that it's got right and the areas that it's got wrong. And every time you run the iteration, you hope to refine the process to make it more accurate. That's essentially how it works. Now, the problem here is that the kind of training data that East was trained on is nothing like the kind of data that we've got. Inscriptions are quite irregular. They can, as you've seen, they can be very fragmentary. Photographs can be quite skewed, for instance, where you're having to stand at the base of a monument and take a photograph of an inscription that's quite high up. We obviously have problems with weathering and damage to the stone. The contrast in photographs of inscriptions is sometimes not very high between the text and everything around it. And of course, there are characters in the inscriptions that don't exist in the modern world. We also have things like ligatures in Latin inscriptions. That's where two or more letters are joined together. So there were quite a few issues that we thought we might encounter. We broke the work down into two stages. Firstly, we detected areas of an image that contained text. So we were looking for creating boxes essentially around the areas where there is text. And then secondly, we were looking for locating characters within those, what we call bounding boxes. So in the areas that contain text, can we actually identify individual characters and then do something with them? The East method does this in two stages. It produces a score map, which basically says for every pixel, how likely is it that there's text in that pixel? And then it produces a series of coordinates. So it produces the coordinates of the four corners of the bounding boxes, essentially. In terms of training the network, the way we did that was to add images from the EDH database to the existing training data that East was trained on. And we gave it all sorts of things. We gave it everything from really clear, high-quality photos, right through to really problematic ones where it was actually really hard to read the inscription. We gave it a good range, and then we sort of sat back and waited to see what it would come up with. We made the decision not to decide in advance which inscriptions we thought were planned out. The whole point of this was to try to identify whether we could find patterns in the planning of inscriptions that were perhaps not obvious to us to start with. So rather than selecting specific inscriptions from the point of view of, oh, this one looks like it's been planned out and this one looks like it hasn't, we decided to be fairly indiscriminate with that and just to give it all sorts of different types of texts. And that was a deliberate decision. So the procedure had three stages. We selected the images of the inscriptions with the accurately detected text. Then we removed from those images any areas of text that hadn't been correctly identified. So in other words, when the machine learning process returned images where it had managed to detect some text, we removed any false negatives and then retrained the model on that data set. So we augmented that data set with those modified images and sort of fed them back into the next stage of the process, if that makes sense. Okay, let's have a look at what it actually managed to come up with. This was a completely experimental project, and this was its first stage. And the end of the first month, Dimitri came to me and said, here's what it's done so far. Here's what we've managed to get so far. And the results in month one were fairly underwhelming. You can see here that it hadn't managed to find any text in this inscription whatsoever. By month 2, it had started to identify areas of text, and you can see that it had identified 3 lines of text, plus some chisel marks at the top it thought were text. And by month 3, it had identified all 4 lines of text, but it still thought that the chisel marks at the top were text. To take this example, again in month 1, we hadn't got too far with detecting the boxes. By month 2, it was doing a better job, and by month 3, it had found the whole of the inscription. This was a really interesting one. You can see here that we've got some blocks which are inscribed, not all of them are, and we've got some areas of shading from the sun. So you can see here in month 3, and in fact we can zoom in and get a better look, it's still struggling to identify some of the text that is on the shaded blocks. So that's one of the problems that we've come across. You can also see that there are areas of text that it hasn't managed to pick up, even where it's not shaded. And there's an entire block towards the base of this photo that it hasn't identified at all. And here are a few other examples. On the left-hand side, you can see that it's had a problem with the line right at the top. We've got the top left, the first 2 characters it hasn't identified, and we think that's probably because of the damage caused to the stone there in the second and third characters. The inscription in the middle, it's done a reasonable job, but again, it's missing some areas of text, and so we need to work further on making that a bit more accurate. And you can see on the third inscription here, it's done a pretty good job, but the bounding boxes are not absolutely positioned as we'd like them to be. On the final line, you can see that the bounding box should be a bit deeper to take into account that final S. However, we're really pleased with the first stage of the project. There's clearly a fair way to go, but it is actually managing to identify text that we really didn't know when we started that it would be able to identify at all. So the next steps then are in step 2, once we've refined the previous process enough that we're getting a better rate of accuracy to identify those general areas of text, we're going to start extracting the positions of the characters within those bounding boxes, and we're going to use weakly supervised semantic segmentation for that. We've got some really preliminary results, but there are definitely some issues that we need to resolve. So you can see here our very first tests. We've got some strange vertical lines going on in the outputs, which we need to deal with. So these are taking the text that's found within the bounding boxes, and it's saying, okay, look for specific characters and show us the outlines of those characters. Now, this obviously needs refining quite significantly in order to make those measurements, but we're quite pleased that we've got this far in a relatively short amount of time. The idea then is that we're going to continue to improve the accuracy of the text detection. We're going to locate the individual letters within those bounding boxes and refine that to improve the accuracy. So keep doing further iterations of the machine learning process. We're going to hopefully match the identified text with the transcriptions that exist in EDH. All of the inscriptions in the Epigraphic Datenbank at Heidelberg they're all available as epidoc.xml, and so we can use that to essentially teach the machine to, in inverted commas, read the image. then obviously at that point we can start thinking about taking those measurements that we need between the letters, and line, in borders and between the lines, and we're going to try to establish that whether or not there were modules that were underlying some of these inscriptions. We're absolutely not expecting to find that modules underlay some of the inscriptions, but we do think that it's possible that we might be able to do some interesting work in identifying at least some areas where inscriptions were being planned out, and then look at how that was happening and whether or not they match the kind of ratios that were identified by Grasby and other people who've worked on this in the past. It's worth saying that this is very much a kind of, it's meant to be, at least to my mind, a way of illuminating perhaps on a large scale areas that it's then going to be interesting to go and investigate using more traditional methods and more precise methods. I mean, obviously, with using images from any database, we're only going to be able to achieve a certain level of accuracy with machine learning, and we're then going to need to use what we've found and apply much more detailed measurement, ideally in person, of some of those inscriptions to understanding whether or not there were these underlying modules. So I see the machine learning process here very much as being a help to traditional epigraphic methods. And hopefully all of that should take us one step closer to understanding what went on in the Roman workshop. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was brilliant. That was incredibly interesting, and I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. Now, the way we're going to do this, I'm going to swap between questions from the poll and questions from the chat. And if I could ask the first one, my question would be the first one about the images that you, so before you feed them to East, did you clean them up at all in terms of contrast, shading,
nope,
any of that?
Everything went in as is. There was no pre-processing at all. Of course, it would be possible to apply various kinds of processing first, but we decided that we would see what could be done just with the images as they currently are available.
And then when you crop the bits with the false, with no results at all, did you feed them again as they were,
so
or did you?
The only manipulation that went on there is, in fact, we didn't crop them. We sort of used I guess you'd say a sort of a brush almost to sort of scratch out the areas that it hadn't identified correctly, and then we fed those back in, and that's all we did. That's the only manipulation we used, and then we fed those back in, and then in each iteration of the machine learning process, it got a little bit more accurate each time. It's very early days. I should stress that this is very much a kind of a pilot project, and we've only been going for a few months, so there's so much more work to do on this. It's very much a kind of beginning, which is, I thought I wasn't sure about whether to present it at this stage, but it seemed to me that it would be really interesting to see where you could get to in a small amount of time, and then perhaps get some sort of comments and feedback on what people thought about the project and whether they thought it was it had points of interest, and thinking about where we could go from here.
I think, go a long way from here, but I will stop talking now and allow others.
So I was going to ask, following precisely on what you just said, short version of the question: what next? Can you imagine? I mean, I'm imagining you're a huge funding bid following this, because this is going to be such, so much to do, so much possibility, so much potential, so many research questions. Can you imagine the next stage being less than a 5-year project? Can you imagine small steps that would already be useful?
I think because we've broken the project down into sort of 2 main areas, and work needs to be done on both of those areas, I think it would be possible to do some of it in smaller stages. But actually, I mean, perhaps a 3-year project, perhaps a 5-year project. I mean, that makes me think of something that I think it was right at the beginning of contributions to the paleography of Latin inscriptions. Somewhere in the preface, I think the Gordons say something like, if we'd known what this would have involved, we'd never have started it in the first place. So I think a project like this could be an extremely long-term thing. Certainly, if you're combining the machine learning process with more traditional epigraphic methods, I mean, this is something that you could work on for many, many years, and it could involve lots of people. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it progresses. I was thinking the other day, I wish Richard was still around. It would have been amazing to work with him on this, because I think he himself potentially might have been interested in such a project. But thankfully, there are lots of people who are working in epigraphy now who might find this of interest.
Yeah, Richard would have loved this. This would have been absolutely up his tree. This was, the ability to to sort of measure letters and to something throw back, because he would spend a year with one inscription, something that would throw back thousands of examples, and he could just look at one of them and say, well, here's confirmation or not, and he might go grab a piece of stone and try it out and see if it worked, that sort of thing. I mean, he would love, that would have been so cool.
I mean, the years of experience that he had were invaluable, obviously, to his analysis. And it was really hard to explain the spacing thing. I'd almost like to go back, and I know I can't do that part of the presentation again, but I'd like to go back and explain the spacing more clearly. I mean, you basically need another hour to go through Richard's work in any reasonable detail. But I think that in terms of where we go from here, I think the most crucial thing at this point is to refine the machine learning process to make it more accurate. So some of those problems that I mentioned to do with the shading on the stones and lack of contrast and damage and so on, I think we need to be able to deal with those better, because we can't start taking measurements until we've got a pretty accurate means of identifying those characters, and we've only just started on that bit of the project. So, yeah.
When you were talking about the spacing of the letters and his very precise measurements you had there, it did make me wonder how much the stonecutter would have done that deliberately and how much they would have done that instinctively, because it made me think, the way you were describing it, it made me think of font kerning, right? Digital font kerning. And that is something that fonts have relatively recently. We've had computer fonts for a long time that looked terrible. They were all fixed width fonts and and everything. And font kerning was over time became a more and more advanced algorithm for making text look more readable and whatever. And this is something that people on printing presses have been doing for hundreds of years, and people in handwriting have been doing for many hundreds of years, completely instinctively or largely instinctively. We handwrite, we kern, but we don't say, oh well, I need to make this a little bit wider because it's a W. We know that.
So that's one of the really interesting things actually about looking into this is the question of what was done by the person who was planning out the inscription on the stone, and then what was done by the stonecutter themselves. Obviously, sometimes that's the same person, sometimes it might be different people, and there's undoubtedly a case to be made for the lettercutter having a certain degree of freedom, I suppose, within the planned inscription, to make some kind of changes and to make some kind of decisions about spacing. But again, it needs so much more work to be able to give a really good answer to that.
Thank you, Charlotte. Let's go to the live chat. We have the other Charlotte asking, do you expect to identify a learning process based on the fact that Latin inscriptions are reasonably consistent?
A learning process in terms of, in what sense?
I think in terms of producing the documents.
Yeah, her second comment.
There is a follow-up question saying, does the provincial stonecutter simply learn from the document?
Yeah, sorry, I was in a world of machine learning process. In terms of whether inscriptions are, that's an interesting question. I suppose it depends how much material we have from one particular site and how easily we can date the inscriptions. I mean, obviously, dating inscriptions is always difficult in terms of whether we can see clear evidence of a learning process over time at the same site. That would be really interesting if we could pick that up.
And Charlotte is also clarifying, across space, how does that work when you're outside of Rome?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. At the moment, I don't know the answer to that. I can think of some examples that I've looked at from both Spain and Portugal, actually, where it seems as though certain stones were probably cut in the same workshop, and you might imagine that that particular area might have become a sort of centre of learning, the sort of letter cutting trade, perhaps. But it's all very tentative at the moment, and I'd like to think that we could identify clear evidence of sort of progression in stone cutting methods, I guess, across time. But honestly, at the moment, I don't know whether we'll be able to do that.
Which kind of connects to Colin's question, which you partially answered. Can you see any patterns in terms of workshops yet, or is that totally into the future?
So it's very much into the future. I think I said that it was a very tentative possibility, if you can have such a thing. Yeah, I'd like to think that we would be able to identify the work of individual workshops. I think that would be fantastic. Obviously, there has been work done on this in other areas. I'm thinking of the work that was done on the attic lettercutters, but at the moment, certainly in terms of this project, because we're right at the beginning, we don't have any clear evidence for that yet. But it's definitely something that I'm hoping will come out of the project. It's worth saying perhaps that in the album of dated Latin inscriptions, there are a couple of examples where the Gordons identify a couple of texts where they think that they were cut by the same person, even, and they gave some reasons for that. I think that's probably a bit of a dream for a project like this. I'm not sure that we'd ever be able to get down to that level of detail, but you never know. It could happen.
Thank you. Oh, we all hope it does happen. Do we have any more questions from the call? And then I'll go back to the chat. Okay, I'll ask another one. Oh, Gabby, go ahead. Okay. Have you spoken to a modern stonecutter yet, or is that a plan for the future larger project? Because there are a few who have studied bits of epigraphy, interested, knowledgeable, etc. It might be just to see how, obviously you've talked to Grasby and everything, but to see a slightly different, potentially, perspective on the process.
Absolutely. I'm in contact with a stonecutter, a workshop, and I'm hoping that there will be something fruitful that comes out of that. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at how potentially our understanding of Roman lettercutting processes might be able to inform modern lettercutting processes as well. In other words, I think we can both learn from what modern lettercutting practices do, but also potentially contribute to their work with Roman capitals, because obviously Latin inscriptions are looked upon as a key part of sort of the learning process when it comes to cutting letters in the modern world. And I think it would be really interesting to work directly with a modern lettercutter and sort of see it from both points of view, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, going back to the chat, Caroline is asking, can you foresee needing higher quality images as part of the process?
Potentially, yes. The image quality is obviously an issue. I'd like to do some case studies where we have access to images that are higher quality than the ones we currently have. I mean, some of the photographs we have are actually pretty good. Others were taken decades ago or were taken in bad conditions. So it would be very good to have perhaps a case study as part of the larger project that would involve looking at some high quality images. Definitely, I mean, that would help us to take more accurate measurements for sure. And as I say, I'd like to combine that with autopsy as well, so that we can take measurements in person too.
Yeah, makes sense. And related to that, Caroline is asking, do you foresee an integration, or I suppose a partial integration, between East and other software used for digital epigraphy? And I know she's talking about archetype/digital, but generally, do you foresee a work like a pipeline of using several tools together?
Absolutely, yeah. And what I'm hoping is that in fact we might be able to produce something that then would be useful for analysing other epigraphies. It's worth saying that obviously this is certainly not the only project that's using machine learning to analyse inscriptions. I mean, we heard right at the very beginning of the Digital Classicist seminar series from Taya Summershields, who's been working on the Pythia project, which looks at texts and at trying to work out what the next letter will be. And there are also projects which are looking at analysing 3D versions of inscriptions, and I think that there are quite a lot of potential areas where we could actually, have crossovers in our work. And I'd like this project, if it comes to fruition, to be useful for analysing, not just Latin inscriptions, but obviously other inscriptions. I mean, there's no reason why, once we've created something that can be used for these texts, why it couldn't be repurposed. And whilst we've been using East, I mean, it's not necessarily going to be, it's not necessarily the only option. It's the one we've experimented with so far, but there might be other options as well.
Yeah, I can see several comments in the chat about, so first Simon asking about, so in art there are evidence of workshops using outlining techniques, etc. So it stands to reason something similar would have been done for inscriptions. So do you have any plans for including some methodologies from art history, let's say?
I haven't thought about that yet, but I think that would be a really good idea. Obviously, a lot of these inscriptions may well have been produced in the same workshops, or at least, even by some of the same people potentially, I guess, as some of the sculptures. I mean, it's hard to know. I think we should definitely be working together rather than sort of going off in all sorts of different directions. So yeah, I would definitely like to talk to people who are doing that.
Excellent. Enlarging your project as we go. And related to what you were saying about training on different kinds of text, Hernan is asking, do you think it would be interesting in potentially enriching of the algorithm to train on different languages and writing styles?
Yeah, that's definitely something we'd like to do. I mean, we're starting off with Latin inscriptions because obviously that's something that I work on and I'm interested in. I'm really keen to develop this ultimately, as I say, as something that can be used much more widely. So at the moment, we've got training data from EDH, but obviously there are lots of other databases. There are lots of other images we could use. You could kind of expand this project indefinitely, really. I think the challenge to start with will actually just be keeping it within reasonable boundaries in terms of what can be achieved over, say, a 3 or 5 year period. And that might mean that there are projects working in parallel, which are in touch with each other and sharing methodology, that kind of thing. Or it might mean that there's an initial project and then it branches out.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing plan, but tricky to organize potentially. Gabby, go ahead.
On the subject of images, clearly the strength of a machine learning project like this is in scale. So I was thinking about ways of scaling up. I mean, obviously you've already got 30 or 40,000 images, which is larger than could be analyzed by a human in a lifetime of an ordinary project, or in the lifetime of many humans. But if you were going to scale up, so there's you'll find thousands of photographs of inscriptions on places like Flickr, on places like Wikimedia Commons, a whole bunch that were uploaded by Eagle, although I don't know what proportion of that were the EDH inscriptions photographs already. But I wonder what metadata would you need to be attached to these images to make them useful to you? So we've had people talk about date, we've thought about location, any attachments to that. What other metadata do you think is useful to you, or do you just throw in raw images and,
well, in terms of the analysis, thank you. In terms of the analysis, I would say that if we want to do things like analysing, obviously how things change over time, how things change according to place, that's obvious. But also you might want to think about things like monument type, material. We might want to think about things like inscription type as well. I mean, are there some types of inscription that are more likely to be planned out in certain ways? Does it depend on where a monument might be placed? Is there a correlation there? It would also be interesting to look at things like, you could sort of drill down to very fine levels of detail and think about things like, are there particular parts of an inscription that are sort of emphasized in a certain way? Are there particular types of information that's being put across in a text that's likely to be emphasized in terms of the size of lettering? Or, I mean, there's so many things that you could investigate. In terms of the metadata,
does the writing get messier at the bottom margin as it does, as my handwriting does, for example?
Right. I mean, there's so much that you could do. I mean, the kind of metadata that's associated with the EDH inscriptions is pretty useful as it is, actually. So I would say that's already a good basis. And if inscriptions were, I've just seen the question from Charlotte. If inscriptions were all sort of published along those lines, I mean, I guess that would be quite useful to the project. Yeah. Sorry, Charlotte's question flashed up and then it disappeared. How much difference does the kind of stone make? How much difference in terms of our ability to be able to run the machine learning process?
I think she was just throwing in another example of the things you were talking about in terms of what metadata might be helpful. That's how I read it anyway.
Yeah.
I read it in a different way, but go ahead and answer first, and then I'll see.
So that would be an interesting thing to look at. I would say but because I don't know exactly how you meant the question, I'm going to answer the one that I thought of, which is some types of stone are clearly more difficult for the machine learning process. Very crumbly stone is a bit of a problem. Basically, anything that causes a difficulty in contrast between text and everything that surrounds it is a bit of a problem. But yeah.
Thank you. Just to add a small bit to this, because if Charlotte meant it in terms of how much difference does it make the stone in terms of the execution of the writing, or the spacing, or the depth, the font, the choice of font, etc. I learned that in the Stonecutter studio that it does very much matter. The smoother the stone and the softer the stone, obviously, the more detailed and pretty, let's say, you can make the inscription. The crumblier the surface is, the more difficult it is to plan it very precisely and execute it as precisely as you would want to do, which in turn would have an impact on the machine learning, obviously, because the quality of what you feed the algorithm would be different.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I can imagine it would make a difference, and it's interesting to hear that that's a problem in modern stone cutting practice as well. Certainly, in terms of what we have left, you can see that as well. I can think of some inscriptions that I studied a little while ago now, where it's quite clear that the stone must have been incredibly hard to carve in the first place. But no, that would be another very interesting aspect to look at as well. You see, the trouble with doing something like this is you've now given me absolutely loads of directions to that I could go off in, and yeah, I've got to try and keep this manageable. But yeah,
that's what we like to hear. Do you have any questions from the call? No. Anyone else?
There is one more comment from Charlotte.
Oh yes, that one. Suppose you could be looking to see how sculptors adapt. Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
That would be very interesting. Okay, I'm calling last questions, both from the chat and from the call. If this is all.
For me, just to say it was really interesting, especially to see how we can integrate it with PIFIA that was presented in this dataset as well. And it's also interesting to see how the neural networks are starting to be more used now. We've seen many projects that are applying them at the moment. We'd like to see what's being published about that and whether other projects are starting to use them.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, I'm really excited actually.
We're looking forward to that longer project that you can now draft. Great. Oh, wait, there's another question. Any difference between funeral and other monuments? Asks someone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, both monument type and sort of content of text is something that I want to look at for sure. Yeah.
Architecture high as opposed to so sight lines and things.
Yeah, I mean that is an interesting question in terms of thinking about who can see what where. That is something that I think would be worth looking at as well. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned something about that when you were talking about the photographs and how it depends very much on the angle that you took the photograph from and how that can be read, etc. And of course, you have the metadata. So,
Abigail Graham's done some really interesting work on positioning of inscriptions, and that's worth looking at as well. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all very much. If that is all, then we can thank Charlotte very much for talking
thank
to us
you.
today and give her the floor.
Thank you to everyone for the invitation, and thank you for all the questions as well and the comments. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all, and see you at a currently unidentified point in the future, sometime in the fall, for the last of these year's